Now I would like to ask Rohinton Medhora, President of the Center for International Governance Innovation.
Jeff, thank you. I've been asked to reflect on big data and new technologies and how they work in the context of this conference. I guess I'd begin with a few context-setting points and then end with what we might do to improve the situation. And I'd begin by saying that data is actually part of a continuum, and we've always known this. Data is a continuum that goes from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. And for this continuum to work well, two things would be at play. One is the technology that links them, and the second is values. Now, whether you call it values, ethics, or morality, as Joe Stiglitz pointed out, technological change and how we transform ourselves is not exogenous. It is, in fact, something that is endogenous and is or should be driven by a value system. Now, there's something about new technology that perhaps breaks that chain, and there are certain characteristics in the digital economy that might be worth flagging. Digital firms tend to face high upfront risk and high fixed costs, but once you have it made, you really have it made, and marginal costs often tend to be zero. This also gives advantage to first movers, and it prioritizes strategic behavior. It also means that a lot of the profits that are made are effectively monopoly rents. And so this is the environment, the economic logic that is compelling firms increasingly to behave the way they do. Now, if you think about data and how it fits into this model, the fact is data comes with different imperatives. And so if I'm a national government and I want to think about how we deal with data strategy, it seems to me that there's at least 5 aspects that we should be balancing. Obviously, data has the potential to create immense amounts of wealth. And that's not a bad thing because we need that wealth to do social good. But at the same time, data has characteristics that make us value our privacy. They make us prioritize public security. As we've learned in the last few years, data is imperative if we want to preserve our open society and have a healthy democracy. And in many ways, data infrastructure works the same way that physical infrastructure did generations ago, which is just as with railroads and broadcasting and so on, it is part of the nation building and social fabric building consensus. And so it's not surprising that we find that the world is effectively, unfortunately, balkanizing into 3 zones. You have the state-centric China zone, where effectively you cede data to the state. Its counterpart in some ways is the US zone, where it's big firms to whom you have ceded that sovereignty. And then in Europe you have the GDPR, where it's in principle person-centric. And there's a host of countries, in fact the majority of the countries in the world, who lie outside these 3 zones. And so I think the question going forward is how do we have a global data zone that balances all of these exigencies while valuing that each country at any given point in time might want to balance these differently. And so I'd begin with the overall. And Joe Stiglitz mentioned the 10 Commandments. More recently, we have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And I would argue that we need something similar for new technologies, that we need a broad moral and pragmatic statement that will guide us all in how technology is created and how technology is used. Now, if I use the UDHR as the example, you might say, well, what's the point? I mean, there's lots of countries who sign on and have no intention of abiding by its tenets. And I'd say we still need one because it's aspirational. Having aspirations is a good thing. Having a clear moral statement is a good thing. And people across the world look to these statements even and especially in societies where they're not being valued. Second, this kind of statement actually guides national and subnational legislation. So it has a practical value as well. And third, as we've seen with the International Court of Justice, over time, this kind of broad statement can be used to name and shame and ultimately prosecute people who go against its ethos. And so I think there's a good case to be made for why we should have a broad global statement a la UDHR on new technologies or simply on how we use big data. Now from that flow a lot more of what I'd call important but pedestrian issues that we're tackling, perhaps not deep enough and not fast enough, but let me just mention 4 or 5. I mentioned at the outset that huge amounts of wealth can and are being created by new technologies, and that this wealth is awfully concentrated because this is mostly driven by proprietary intellectual property. And so the logical response through the centuries has been public action. You tax wealth and use it for the public good. That imperative becomes even stronger going ahead than it has been in the past. And so the attempts to harmonize taxation, particularly of digital firms, to understand that monopoly rents have to be treated as such and treated differently is something that we should pay increasing and indeed multilateral attention to. Second, innovation tends to be concentrated in a few parts of the world and a few regions within those parts of the world. How innovation is diffused is something we haven't paid enough attention to. And in fact, the only global framework we have on this TRIPS goes back at least 2 decades. And the fact is, as we think ahead to all the potential good that technology can do, we need to revisit that framework. We've done it in ad hoc ways. During the HIV/AIDS crisis, we had compulsory licensing. We do have mechanisms like advanced market commitments. We have grand challenges. But we do need to revisit the way innovation is created and especially diffused. Because if you think of something like climate change, if there is a path-breaking technology, it works best if everyone adopts it instantly and really well. And that goes against the tenets of the way currently technology is diffused. And so we need to revisit why technology is created and how it is diffused. I'd also make the point, again, in the spirit of saying that the use of technology is not exogenous. If I created a slightly better headache pill, it's going to take me a good 7 to 13 years to get it to market. If I create an algorithm that improves facial recognition that might lead to a better cure for acne or something much better or much worse, it pretty much happens instantly. And so you have to ask yourself, if we use an FDA-type model in some parts of the health industry, why don't we have it more broadly? And so I think algorithmic accountability, algorithmic ethics should be part of the public policy framework and not seen as outside it. And in the same spirit, because, as I said, the economics of this seems to drive predatory behavior, foreign investment is something that increasingly countries around the world, including mine, Canada, are going to have to look at, because when you allow foreign investment in the digital context, you find that it is your data that is at play, it is your workforce that is at play, as you said, and there's a range of issues in which work is done here, but the IP and the wealth created is done there. And so I do think that we have to revisit foreign investment as well. And the final sort of set of points I'd make on this, because I was also asked to think more about multilateral and international cooperation, is that the global system has been sclerotic. On the other hand, it does eventually respond. And we do have now something called the Financial Stability Board, which is an attempt to understand and not have the crisis that we had a decade ago happen again. We might want to think of an equivalent, and my colleagues at CG have talked about this, a digital stability board, something that promotes best practice in the digital realm, that analyzes how data is used, how it's combined, and has the same set of principles that make the digital sector as resilient and problem-free as we would like the financial sector to be. And so I'll end on that note, that These points I made are not outside the intellectual or ethical frame that even mainstream economics teaches. But as Rob Johnson next to me said, how it's taught has kind of gone astray. How it's propagated through the media has gone astray. And what we need now is the will and the ethos to bring it back together. Thank you very much.
Thank you for excellent comments. I can't help but add that when France and other European countries have sought to do exactly what you've said, they have faced the threat of illegal unilateral retaliation from the United States. So this is a matter of power, not only a matter of ideas or even normal politics.